The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is the United Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Friends in Recovery podcast, the podcast that is here to help you, a loved one, or a friend get started down the road to recovery. This is the Friends in Recovery podcast, brought to you by the Genesis House. Genesis House, providing a safe, nurturing environment to heal from addiction since 1992. Please be a friend and share our message with a friend on Podbean, iTunes, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. And now, here are your Friends in Recovery.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Friends in Recovery podcast. I'm Mike Miles.
I'm Ed Chancho.
I'm Brian Casey.
You're an old hat at this now.
It's good to be here.
Got my name down.
Excuse me. I have a little bit of a cold. It's good to be back, Ed.
It is, Mike.
It's been a while.
It is.
No,
It
it's
has.
been about 3 weeks.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, you look good in pink. You look good. Yeah.
That's what all the guys tell me.
So we have a special guest today,
We do.
and it's really nice to have you here, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
I'm glad
Yeah.
to be here.
Yeah. In the past, I think we had a show, Ed, if I'm not mistaken, called Good Cop, right?
Yep.
And it was basically, we were kind of talking about Brian and your book, and for some reason, we all thought you were on this show. I guess that's not true. We looked back in the archives, and
Not us all. You thought he was on the
I thought so too.
yeah, Ed did too. So
Okay.
yeah, all right.
When my kids were little, they said they thought they had been to Disneyland.
That's a good thought.
And they didn't have. And I remember wishing I would have said, yeah, that was a great trip, but we lost the camera.
saved you some money.
Well, we talked about his book in the past, and it finally got published, and he's doing kind of a whirlwind tour that I was blessed to be part of in the Massachusetts area.
Yeah.
So we're going to go visit a bunch of police officers and corrections officers and everybody this week.
You do know you're acknowledged in the book.
I've heard that. I
Okay.
heard that. So I guess everybody has to read the book to find out where I'm acknowledged.
Yeah.
You want to tell us where it's at?
No, I just maybe we'll just leave it open.
Okay.
Yeah. Let him find it.
Yeah,
Let him find
exactly.
it. That way he has to read the whole book.
I did find it at one point.
I
so.
found it.
And you would be too if I had met you earlier.
Oh, that's all right. I'll be in the next book.
That's it. That's it.
The sequel.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's take a step back. I want to thank Genesis House for making all this possible.
Absolutely.
Making this show possible and helping everybody who we help out. And Taylor, thank you very much for getting this going and carrying his dad's legacy on.
Absolutely.
Too, so.
Yep.
Real quick, guys, I want to just take a moment here and mention Katie Barrios. She was a good friend of ours. She ended up dying. She was a police officer in Wisconsin, and she ended up losing her battle with cancer, brain cancer. Unfortunately, she'll be buried tomorrow. There's gonna be a lot of activity out there, and the police officers, and keep Joe and all the kids in your prayers if you can. And it's gonna be a hard next couple days for the family out there. So, and Mike, you went down to the
Yes, I did.
Yeah, you knew Katie and Joe and the kids and everything. So,
Tough situation, and
Yep.
God bless her family. Obviously, young mother, two
Yep.
children,
Yep.
police officer,
yeah.
and you and your family, your wife, so involved, and I don't know, good stuff.
Yep.
Sad stuff, but good stuff.
Yeah,
And
she made a lot of impact on a lot of people
Right.
throughout, just like you guys did. You guys
Right.
do, and Brian, you still do. And well, why don't you tell us a little bit about you, Brian, and who you are, and what you do, and what this book is?
Okay, thanks.
So-
I'm a police sergeant for the St. Paul Police Department, and we've had for an internal employee assistance program for some 27 years, and for the last 5 years, I've been the director of that. I'm not a clinician. I've got a health education degree. I don't know if you ever met someone with such a degree. But 30 years after getting that, I find myself working with mostly police officers with mental and emotional distress, and including substance use disorders. And I feel like I'm using my health education background. And then I'm not a clinician, so I contract with therapists in private practice. We have a model that works really good for our size agency.
right.
Yeah, but you're peer-to-peer, which is really important for a lot of the officers out there.
Absolutely. So we run a peer team like other agencies do, and so I manage that, and then from our own agency, and then I also do what I call peer support. I invite, when we do our training, I invite any peer support team in the region, Minneapolis-St. Paul area, or I should say St. Paul, Minneapolis area. They're welcome to attend. And some of those teams are really fledgling and struggling to get going. And so we train together.
Sure. Here we are, 2019, and you know, police, fire, EMS. You know, I think society's really starting to see that, you know, it is a different type of profession where, you know, you're really subject to a lot of internal problems. And you know, I think they've always known that. The average life expectancy of a police officer is about 18 years less than the average worker, you know. And the reason being is it's all the internal, you know, physical, emotional stuff that you see and you partake in, and how you handle it. So my point is, you know, it's guys like yourself, and I was an EAP for a couple of departments. We know because we're there, but it's just society's just starting, I think, to understand it, and you know, it's good. And like you said, a lot of these departments they don't have anyone.
No.
You know, they go see a regular doctor.
They don't know who to turn to. Yeah, a doctor, and the doctor prescribes some benzos, and then everything's good. But that we know that's solved, not. That's, you know, AA works, and
this book is so good, not just for police officers or EMS. But it's well written. I you know, we were talking before the show, and Brian said it took him a good 3 years to get this published and put together. And I got to, you know, compliment you on that because you're doing a lot for the profession.
Well, every time I went out to see you, Brian, it was like, I'm going to write this book. I'm like, here we go again. Jesus Christ, this fucking guy, man. What are you doing? You know? And then finally he did it. One day he came, we were at the cigar bar in St. Paul.
Yeah.
And he's like, I wrote the book. And I'm like, and you showed me all the pictures of the.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So I was I had like the inside track on this book.
Yeah, and it was a smoky haze. You think it looks pretty good.
And here you are again, another cigar
smoky
lounge,
haze.
So.
Well, and Mike mentioned this I think this is so important that some agencies, I think at your agency and mine, we really encourage the conversations where cops talk about distress.
Right.
Where some agencies, because they have so few resources, those conversations like, why are you talking to me? Go to your health insurance. Where we're like, we invite at my agency and others. We really invite cops to start talking about their distress, and we're like, "Thanks for coming. I think we can come up with a good plan for you."
Right, and you know, I've had police officers who've talked about suicide ideation, ideas of suicide. You know, they're afraid to mention it. You know, I have an 8-page clinical evaluation I do on all my clients, not just cops, but on any client, and it covers everything. It's kind of like that Prego spaghetti sauce. Every human emotion is in this, and suicide's in it 3 times because I want to make sure that, you know, somebody that is in a stressful job or going through a stressful situation where there seems like there's no hope, you know, they're never going to get it resolved, they might think of suicide. And that doesn't mean that you're going to commit suicide, nor does it mean that there's something seriously wrong with you. But I think a cop would be less apt to go see a regular social worker or a therapist or even a psychiatrist and say, yeah, I'm thinking of hurting myself. Because right away they think they're going to lose their job.
Yeah, lose their gun and you know, their whole livelihood. Let me ask you why, and maybe you guys can answer, because you guys are cops and you're still on the job and everything. Why is suicide so high amongst police officers and substance abuse? What like, I mean, it's out there, and we know a lot of the younger kids are getting into the opiates and everything. But why police officers? Because of the trauma? Because of what you guys see? Because of what you guys do? Is it the lifestyle? I mean, and you know, I know it's kind of covered in this book, but I'm just kind of getting that information out there. Maybe, you know.
Well, I think
next
it is. It's kind of actually, thankfully, kind of a hot topic recently. One of the things is the lethality. So police officers always have access to a pistol. You know, so that's part of it. Mike probably can. I'll just say one thing about prevention or dealing with it that I think is really important, and that's why Genesis House and other treatment facilities and culturally competent therapists like yourself, and when I mean culture, like police culturally competent, to focus on access to good mental health resources and to deal up front with substance use disorders, that's suicide prevention.
Sure.
That is incredibly powerful stuff to try to deal effectively with it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I had the opportunity to work for the Middlesex Sheriff's Department for as a correctional officer back in the 70s, and as a therapist. as an EAP for the last 3.5 years, up until last June of 2018, three and a half years prior. And I work with, hundreds of correctional officers. And the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has done this study. And it came out in 2017, so it's a pretty new study. If you look at some studies, they go all the way back to the 70s, and they're good ones. There's one by Dr. James Reese. He's retired, FBI agent, and awesome man. But he was doing behavioral health for law enforcement way back in the 70s and 80s, and his studies are spot on. But here's my point. Police officers used to be number one in suicide, number one in divorce, as far as careers go, number one in substance abuse, which back then was more likely alcohol. Correctional officers surpassed them in the 2000s, 2003, 2004. So now they're number one in suicide. And you got to look at these stats and say something's going on here. It's just people.
Why corrections?
Well, my opinion, and from what some of the studies say, is I think it has to do with being in a confined area. At least as you're a cop, you're in a cruiser. You can drive away from something. You can go get a hamburger or whatever you choose, a pizza or whatever. Just take a ride along the river and enjoy the scenery.
Yeah.
When you're in jail, you're around. There's
Bad
very little
people.
you can look at.
You're around bad people all the time.
Right, and some of them might be the people you work with. You think you have a closeness, and then they betray you, or they get promoted, and you feel like they betrayed you, and there's a lot of animosity and stuff. So I don't know the exact answer to that, but I know what the findings say, and they say it's the environment, and it's the mundaneness of being, doing the same job, the same repetitious job, night after night, week after week, year after year.
Well, we actually had the pleasure of meeting with the corrections yesterday from
did you?
the Stadies.
Middleton.
Yes. Yep. We're at Middleton, and Keith watches all our podcasts.
Yeah.
He's
great.
He likes them. So hey, Keith, how's it going? I told him he was going to be on and watching us today. So.
Give him a shout.
Yeah, I know. But he basically said, we're locked up here, like you said, 24 or whatever their shift is, 12-hour shifts. And they're around bad people. They have no weapons, no phones. They have a radio.
Dangerous job.
And that's it. And anything could break out at any time.
That's right.
Now you got a bunch of bad guys in there, and that's causes a lot of stress. And I liked what Bob said yesterday. Here's another guy that was in the office. He said that there's a breaking point for every corrections officer. Right. And he said it was about 17 years
for him. Yeah.
And I think Keith said it was about the same time for him. I guess there has to be a breaking point if you're thrown in jail. These guys are in jail. That's what they're in jail for their job.
This is why the corrections have been offered in Massachusetts. I can only speak for Mass, but early retirement. Like after 20 years, they're entitled to a pension. It's 50% of their pay. A lot of these guys start in their 20s, right out of the service, or girls start, right out of college. There's more women matriculating into, corrections, but they give them this opportunity to retire because you do get burnt out. You really can get burnt out. And
you quit rather quickly and became a cop, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't quit, but
you moved on.
Yeah, I moved on. Well, I wanted to be a cop, and there was no openings.
Yeah.
So I became a correctional officer, and I had been a military police officer 3 years prior. I was in the Army for 3 years. And then when I got the job of my dreams, so to speak, I left the corrections. And that's almost commonplace now for a lot of young adults, right? We were talking about that earlier. They leave corrections and they go to policing, which is very similar jobs some ways,
Well, do you agree with this? Because a lot of people will compare law enforcement with EMS and firefighting. And I was a paramedic for 20 years. I understand that industry. I actually think in a lot of maybe even toxic exposures, we have a lot more in common with corrections officers than we do with a firefighter, for example.
100%. I've been to fires. I've been the first one off at major fires as a cop on patrol. Boom, my house is on fire. We're there. What are we supposed to do? We don't have any equipment. We don't have a Scott air pack. We don't have an axe to break down the door or to make vents. We don't even know the nomenclature of what a house on fire, what should we do?
It's not your job.
We're not being trained.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus you're parked in front of the hydrant.
Right. and I did that once.
Car.
And I had a lieutenant jump out and yell at me. Of course, kind of immature at the time, or probably still am, and I was offended. He was yelling at me. He's like, "Move that fucking cruiser!" I'm like, "Who the hell are you?" At the house. In the meantime, the house is burning down.
Can't you use another hydrant?
Well, I don't know if you said it yesterday or if it was in a book that I read that police officers police officers are targets. If there's a cop, a fireman, and an EMT, who's the bad guy going to target?
Right.
The police officer, of course.
Right.
I mean, because you guys are the most threat to that person. And what was the fireman going to do? Squirt him with his fucking hose? Well, no offense against the firemen, but I love firemen just as much. So.
Well, no, for police officers, partly is that you're on guard for sudden violence all the time.
Right.
Whenever you're in public in uniform, you're on guard for something. And I didn't always feel that way as a paramedic.
Okay.
Even though I was an urban paramedic.
Right.
You worried about bloodborne pathogen exposures.
Right. Needles.
Firefighters have their own set of dangers.
Sure.
So that's a big difference. The book, it was intended for all public safety workers,
Right.
including corrections and dispatch, and it speaks to all of them. I purposely focused on law enforcement, partly because I feel like that's the hardest audience to reach.
Right.
Yes.
And I feel that their need, because of some of the things I talk about in the front of the book, on guard for sudden violence, certain cynicism, separation from society. You become a little separated out from society. And others, I felt like their need was, the message needed to be more pointed towards them.
I couldn't agree with you more. Mm-hmm. And I've seen firefighters and EMS. I mean, as a therapist, I'm a licensed therapist. And I know they feel a lot more comfortable, too. We all speak the same language, all those three professions, and 4 professions with the correctional officers, but everybody does have a different job description. I don't know if you noticed this. I know I noticed it. I'm sure you did, too. But during the Ferguson, Missouri debacle, when Michael Brown, the gentle giant, was shot by Officer Wilson, and Michael Brown's close neighborhood friend went around saying that poor Michael had his hands up saying, "Don't shoot." Mm-hmm. And then the media, the national media, took that liar's words, the guy who was lying, and they actually there were news anchors on these major stations. I think it was
don't say the C word.
All right, I won't say it. All right, it was CNN who actually put their hands up and said, "Don't shoot." Well, here's this think of this. This poor officer this thug tried to steal his gun. Who knows what he's going to do with the gun? I'm sure he wasn't going to crack walnuts with it. He puts his life on the line, and he ends up shooting this kid. Granted, he's 18 years old. I feel bad for any 18-year-old who's been shot. But his choice, number one. Number two, the media never had the actual facts. I thought that was part of being a news media or a reporter. Get all the facts, then write the story. Yeah. But you got these 3 anchors on TV doing this. Then you have other anchors and people in Congress with hoods on.
Yeah.
If that wasn't the beginning of the onslaught of these cops, if you look at statistics prior to what happened in Ferguson and what's happened now to date, in the wall down in Washington, D.C., the memorial wall of all the cops that have been killed, I guarantee you it's been up 200 or 300%.
Yeah. And
that's the reason. I've never seen anybody in the media held accountable for that behavior. Yeah. And shame on them for doing that. Yeah. Shame on them.
And that's where this book comes in to help these guys out through all that. And real quick, I was at a conference a couple weeks ago in Great Falls, Idaho, which your book went over well over there. The dispatchers, 911 dispatchers, fall right into you guys. I'm like, they take phone calls and then they patch them through. This woman played a call, of a guy killing the ex-husband killing the girl's boyfriend at the time. I mean, she heard it all. And they were both on stage. This girl was bawling. This happened a couple years ago. Both of them were bawling because they both had to help out. They didn't even realize there was a kid in there. It was this crazy thing. So these 911 dispatchers are too, and I never knew that, but you guys dealt with them all the time. I'm sure that how they can be affected.
Well,
also.
I don't know if it's the right phrase, but they live in this kind of hearing world. Obviously, they're dispatchers and 911 call takers. So they develop kind of almost an intimacy and just a tone of voice. And so to hear someone pleading, I mean, the cops responding are at a huge advantage. We get to go see how it turns out. We get to intervene. So you're right, and it's very good that you acknowledge that.
Yeah. In a difficult job. I did it myself as a dispatcher. I know what requires. When I did it back in the 70s, there was no training. I mean, other than answering the phone, but they still didn't give you training. Yeah. Dispatchers today, they are so important because, first of all, everything's computerized now. They can tell us as I'm going on a call. I worked in a cruiser for 28 years, early nights, and they can tell you how many times we've been. This is as you're driving there. If there was any violence, if there's any weapons, if there's any prior arrest, at least you know what you're pulling up to. And they have to be responsible for taking phone calls from hysterical, traumatized people that are either hurt or emotionally, just in turmoil. Yeah. And they have to calm them. They delivered babies. They teach people how to take a child that's choking and bring them back to life and get the object out, and or how to deliver a child. I mean, it's really a very stressful job. And when you hear some of these dispatches, they're so calm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a woman locked in the trunk of a car, and somehow she got herself kidnapped. She got her cell phone out. She doesn't know where she's in the trunk of a car, and she doesn't know where she's going. But the communication between her and the dispatcher led to her survival and her being rescued. Mm-hmm. And the dispatcher really, I mean, what does she have to work with? She's talking to a woman who's in a darkened trunk. Yeah.
So how all this ties into the book is that these people are all traumatized. Like you guys seeing what's going on, going into the scene where this guy was shot, and this woman listening to this, the EMT, the helpers need help at some point because there's only so much you guys can take. And is that what you wrote the book about? Just want to get back into the book.
Try to be specific and practical about that, but also just to give this message, and that is sometimes dispatchers, public safety workers develop kind of a flattened affect a little bit, and sometimes that scares them, that something's wrong with them, and sometimes you get feedback by the public that you're just too... But that's actually a protective mechanism. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I do in the book is I try to reassure the cops that some of the things that they think is distressing and wrong with them are natural pathways. Mm-hmm. Even anxiety and depression can be very appropriate in certain scenarios in response to trauma. Yeah. So even after I meet with officers after involving critical incidents as well, and sometimes I remind them that the gaps and crooked lines in their memory might be a sign of a high-functioning brain, not a low-functioning brain, because you weren't supposed to pay attention to certain things because of your super focus. Mm-hmm. So part of the book, and my personal experience of my years in working in ambulance work and police work, is how normal some of these reactions are. Mm-hmm. They're not. You don't have to pathologize everything, and then give them some guidance and reassurance. We have to attend to our health and well-being. If you're going to ignore it, a wheel's going to fall off and you're going to go in the ditch. Eventually. It's actually, these crises are absolutely predictable. Yeah. And even cops, they sometimes think stuff just falls out of the sky and hits them on the head. Mm-hmm. We can see. Think about a cop in recovery or say we talk about a cop that maybe we use the term crashes and burns. Mm-hmm. All right. Everybody's like, well, we sure saw that coming. Mm-hmm. Well, what did you see coming? Yeah, right. And we can go backwards and see these behaviors. Sometimes it's poor supervision. And the supervision sometimes is not that they don't care, it's that they don't know what to do. And these scenarios are very difficult. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested someday talking to you now or another time about what good supervision did you have.
Such a good point, because, when I look back over my career from 1979 until 2015, community policing started. Accountability for supervisors started playing into effect, because years ago, we were all cops. Whether you were a captain or a patrolman, usually if there was a bad decision or if a cop had a problem with alcohol or some other marital problems, everybody kept mum. Nobody wanted to be the rat or whatever. Yeah. But then people start dying. People start losing their careers. Someone will say, Jesus, that was my brother. Maybe I should have helped him. Mm-hmm. Maybe you should have helped him. You were his boss. Mm-hmm. Well, I was trying to be a good boss, but I thought by not saying anything, he would straighten out his problem. Well,
but also with cops, I think you guys put up walls because you have to protect the public and you have to protect everybody, and then you feel like you have to take that home. And I think you wrote in a book about that. Right.
Well, for example, you want to hide your distress. Yeah. Even creatures do that because they don't want to be eaten by the other animals. Right. They're like, that guy's got a problem. Right. And then cops don't want to show vulnerability out in the public because that might be seized upon them. Right. one thing that, and you brought it up too, is that like in the alcohol section, I have a whole chapter on alcohol, and we know there are other substances,
Sure.
but alcohol is just such a good model to follow,
Yep,
and it's
certainly is.
common and all that. Is just I have a whole section on just good supervision and how supervisors have to get their mind right, not to actually make the problem worse, and to be very deliberate and specific about how to manage these scenarios. And one of the things that I think you'll agree with me, it's absolutely life-saving, can be good supervision.
Absolutely.
You know, you come to Jesus speech and you feel like you did a great thing, and then 5 minutes later, the addiction's got that cop
Right,
again,
right.
and they actually feel more self-loathing afterwards.
Absolutely.
But good supervision, holding them accountable to work expectations,
Right.
actually sometimes is the only leverage you have, and it can be life-saving.
But then that doesn't take it to the next level where this book would come in, or a peer support would come in. I like what you said in the book was that you can't go home and be a cop. You have to.
Yeah, you don't need a cop at home.
Yeah,
you need a husband and a father
exactly
or
what
a
you said.
spouse.
Yeah, that's what you
Right.
said in the book.
Right.
But the supervisor won't tell you that, because the supervisor wants to get the best work out of you, the best cop that he or she can be, And that's where you would come in, and Mike, where you, as far as the EAPs go, would come in and turn to somebody like a peer-to-peer person.
You need good resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need
for
resources, but you're spot on about the supervision, because I had a chief back in '86. I had him prior to that, but in '86 I went to a rehab and I got right, and
Thank God.
thank God. But thank God for him, and he wanted to fire me. He wasn't. He was a guy that I used to think about, waiting for after work, running into him somewhere. I loathed him, and he was an older man, But as I got my head clearer and I became somewhat normal, I can remember when he retired, I wrote him a letter and thanked him for being who he was, and I would never be where I am. And at his wake, one of his family members come up to me and said, my dad read that card you sent him, and he cried.
Oh, that's amazing.
It really touched, it really touched his heart. And I said, because I said to her, you must remember my name, because I stood by his coffin, when a cop dies on duty, or even even if he's been retired, there's something contingent, and we stand at the coffin, and it's a formality. I think it's a very nice formality, just to let the public and the family know we never forgot. But anyway, I volunteered to do that. And at one time I would have said, no, I'm glad he's dead, But it meant a lot to me to hear that. But more importantly, if he had been easy on me, I probably wouldn't be alive,
Yeah.
So good supervision. And nowadays, the bosses, the chiefs and the deputies and the captains, it's a lot of politics too for chiefs, more than for chiefs, especially in this state. But good supervisors. I've had many supervisors. I can think of one particular who's a deputy superintendent now, who told me over my career, this guy needs help, this girl needs help, would you check on them? Never once try to get them jammed up. Didn't tell them that he was going to come see me, and didn't pursue it any further other than to try to give them a shot to get help. That to me is the ideal supervisor in this profession.
Yeah. And that's definitely important to have somebody that's going to stand by you. All right, so we only got a couple minutes left here. So Brian, in your words, why should a cop read this book, number one? And I read this book, and I'm not a cop. I run from shit. I'm a pussy. I don't give a shit, man. I ain't fucking taking bullets for anybody where you guys are. But I got a lot out of this book too. I actually got a lot out of, what section? The exercise and nutrition section was excellent, and the substance abuse section was excellent for me. So I think there's something in it, not just for cops to get this book. I think everybody should get this book. So this is where your shameless plug comes in for everybody to buy it. And but why should a cop or corrections officer or somebody pick this book
It's got 12 chapters, and it covers everything from cop think through specific things like sleep, nutrition, exercise, alcohol, and then it ends with things like purpose-centered policing and a section I call roll call, which kind of pulls it together,
Right.
which also
like that.
highlights
Yeah,
the
yeah.
advantages of being a cop, because you and I were talking, and we've gained a lot from being cops.
Sure, certainly.
And we're advantaged in some
Right.
ways. So that's part of it. And also has some very specific things in here, since we're talking about the alcohol section. It's just some specific step-by-steps supervisors do to get their mind right, to prepare.
Yep.
To try to stand between a cop and their first love.
Yeah.
And and kindness without resolve is they're going to eat that up and spit it out.
Yeah.
So you better be ready to deal with that.
Right, absolutely.
And so there's some specific things, a lot of which I've learned the hard way.
Sure.
Which is the best way to learn stuff, I guess.
Absolutely.
I hope it is.
I agree with that.
So it has that stuff in it, and it's some storytelling
Okay.
about it. It's also in there. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely.
Good cop, good book. I'll tell you that.
Let's find out where
Great
we
book.
can get it from.
Goodcop.com. You can
That's
just
it.
go to the website or to Amazon. But if a group orders like an agency, it's best to order it from the publisher through the website.
And our agency gives every cop. We have the first responders track down at Genesis House. Every cop walks away with one of these books when they come through our program. So
thanks for
Brian,
having
thank
me.
You very
Thanks
much.
for your support.
Brian, thank you.
Thank you,
You're
Brian.
the best.
Yep. Thanks.
I will see you in a couple of weeks, I guess.
Take care, everybody.
See you, Ed.
Stay sober. Thanks, Ed.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.